Few people will look at you funny whenever you mention the band name Disturbed. Of course, whenever Disturbed first came out in the latter part of the 1990s, whenever nu metal was really starting to crank itself up and become a real viable force, both on culture and also on the radio. These were a band that were one of the forefront artists, along with Limp Bizkit, along with the premiere of Godsmack, along with Korn, etc. Whenever The Sickness was released, this was an album that, for a lot of people, really showcased a different side of heavy metal and a different side of vocal theatrics, so to speak. David Draiman's vocal style is very strange, to say the least. He was able to emit these guttural grunts that almost reminded us of other styles of harder music, while at the same time keeping them just tame enough where he could both sound like an animal, but also make it fit in the songs. Sickness is one of those albums that, even if you're not really all that big of a fan of the nu metal craze, or the radio metal craze, the radio alternative metal craze, whatever you want to call it, of the late 1990s and early 2000s, there is a potential that you may own it. And the only reason why you might not own it is because of the reputation that this band has really gotten for themselves ever since then. Coverkillernation, it's time for Disturbed to get this examination. And as everything were to continue with Disturbed, my own idea of the band changed, and the band themselves changed. My idea changed because the first time I've seen them live, and I've seen Disturbed live twice, and both of the occasions have not really been all that great. That was really whenever I started to recognize that this was a band that, well, I think success was kind of going to their head a little bit. It was at an Ozfest. It was the early part of the 2000s, and they were performing some songs off of both The Sickness and Believe. And I remember that even though they were a second stage band, they were not a main stage act whatsoever, and the fans were definitely not very impressed with the band's performance, probably because David Draiman's vocals were quite off-putting. And they were all flipping them off. And of course, David Draiman is very upset and says, "You don't flip off your favorite band, you give them the horns." As true as that might be, maybe that was just Pittsburgh's way of saying, "You suck." Which is funny, considering this area harbors a lot of Disturbed fans. I just saw them 2 years ago, 2011, and while this performance was a little bit better, it is about 8 or 9 years later. And there's a lot of aid there. And this was also Disturbed right as they were about to take a hiatus. Now, of course, as you know, the hiatus wasn't long for David Draiman. Before we get into the new, let's talk about the old. The Sickness, of course, was aided by songs such as Down With the Sickness. And was just this album that really started to blow up and manifest itself all because of radio. And because of songs that were, getting played and replayed and replayed and replayed. Stupefy, of course, being the one that many people will consider, at least of my age or slightly younger, as their gateway drug into the land of Disturbed. Now, for those who have been born a little bit past the 1990 mark, where you were still a little bit too young whenever this first was released, of course you're going to be citing future songs. However, for those of you who are around my generation, you know these songs, you heard these songs, you reheard, and the thing of it is that back then, you didn't mind it. It wasn't something that bogged you down, as it does maybe now. The Sickness was an album that definitely shattered a lot of barriers for this scene, and definitely gave the scene a lot more than just Korn and Limp Bizkit and Godsmack as really the frontrunners. Disturbed showcased that even a band that nobody really had any sort of knowledge of prior, or basically a bunch of upstart newcomers, were able to come through and burst through the doors and really make a name for themselves. And it would happen again for other bands such as Seether and System of a Down eventually. Whenever Believe, their second album, came out, there was a lot of anticipation because of how successful and how unique The Sickness really felt. Whenever people listen to this album, especially through the singles, I think they really marveled at the fact that things sort of transitioned to being just a little bit scatterbrained and all over the place to being a little bit more collective and more put together. And David was doing a lot more singing as opposed to his guttural noises mixed with almost scat rapping. However, something about that really left you kind of thirsting, especially if you're a fan like me. You were really thirsting to see true evolution as opposed to just kind of being reintroduced, albeit in a little bit more of a elongated setting, as to what the band could already do. This album didn't resonate quite nearly as well for me and for a lot of people as opposed to the first one. However, for a lot of new fans that were introduced because of songs such as Prayer, this would be a band that would become an obsession for a lot. Now, as the times moved on, we've seen that Disturbed has done covers. They have done Land of Confusion, which of course was a hugely successful radio hit. And they've done a couple of more albums, such as 10,000 Fists, and of course, their most recent. However, there have been a lot of steps along the way where some people have kind of questioned exactly what their motives were and where exactly they were going. Singles would come and go, and there would be little glimmers of hope here and there, whether it be a guitar solo that actually had a little bit of, methodology behind it, or whether it just be kind of a nice faint little glimpse that maybe Dave was returning to film the way he was back on the first album. See, a lot of people that grew up in my generation, and a lot of people who heard The Sickness, really quested for a lot of material that was very similar to The Sickness, mainly because that is what really seemed to be the pinnacle of the band. However, as things kind of progressed on, it started to become very, very similar. It started to become that this band was not really all of that terrified about, staying exactly where they were. They were A-okay with it. In fact, if anything, they were a little bit more terrified of taking that risk. Taking that one uncalculated risk into some new territory that really was just going to put them either over the top or perhaps to send them down a little bit. It's one of those things that once you get to the top, once you get the crown, you never want to relinquish it. And that sometimes keeps you from really building that monumental album. Imagine if a band like Avenged Sevenfold would have stayed with, metalcore/deathcore, more so on the metalcore front, as opposed to transitioning to more clean singing and really letting the guitars do a lot of talking. Now, granted, there's a lot of fans from those first two albums that would, really love that and probably would be A-okay with it. But the Legions right now, they might not like it as much. History would be changed. Once Disturbed decided to go on hiatus, it became kind of oddly apparent that for a band that is such a commercial success, for a band that is beloved by so many people, the legacy is not going to be something that's all of that worth writing home about. The legacy is going to be for a tremendous premiere album with The Sickness, a very good second album, however, still not quite up to par with the first, and then the remainder, while they were very well received, are all albums that just feel as though just the same as the last one. Now, it seemed as though they were going on a little bit of a heavier concourse with their final release, and then the appendium that went with it, Lost Children. However, at the same time, it definitely seemed ripe that this was the perfect time for the band to sort of take a hiatus, take a little bit of time off. And this is where I have to kind of turn a little bit and actually show a little bit of emotion. Disturbed, you have some talent, you have some real ability. Why the fuck were you not willing to take the risk? Now, I understand I just talked about how I wish that there was some more material that reminded me of the first album, but you know what? I'm not even that big of an asshole that that's all I was really, thirsting for. That's not like that was what was going to bring me back. I was sick and tired of the fact that every goddamn Disturbed single, every single that you put out, for me, felt the same. There was very little difference. I didn't exactly feel any sort of new or, rebuilding engagement to you guys based around each subsequent single that I heard. There was very few glimmers of hope, and those that I heard were pathetic. Sure, you had a song that was on Guitar Hero, and it was kind of fun to play, but who gives a shit? That's Guitar Hero. Does that mean that because I had fun playing it on Guitar Hero, that I was going to go out and buy an album and all of a sudden be a Disturbed-deite again? No, it wasn't, and that isn't what happened. The lacking of uncalculated risks for me is what really turned me off to this band. It's something that happened rather quickly. However, I maintained and held out hope for as long as I possibly could. But then once I started to realize that it was all for naught, I found better things to do. Better bands to love. However, still every so often I think back to the latter part of the 1990s, the early 2000s. I think about being in my room, and I think about listening to Disturbed's The Sickness, and laughing every single time I heard the phrase, "Here I come, I'm dropping plates on your ass, bitch." Every single time I tried to emanate David Draymond's vocals and his guttural noises from Stupefy or Down with the Sickness. And every single time my best friend used it as a theme whenever we would go to wrestling shows. There are a lot of great memories associated with that first album. There are no great memories really associated with any of the albums after that. And really, whenever it comes to the live experience, there are no pleasant, happy memories about Disturbed live. Maybe this is a band that you absolutely love, or a band that you at least respect. Respect would be a little bit far-fetched for me. I'm merely, I guess, neither here nor there about them. Do I hate them? Not necessarily. Do I love them? Absolutely not. However, this is a band that was commercially viable. This is a band that has t-shirts and merchandise galore. David Draymond is, of course, a name brand by himself among the music community. People know who that is. People know what he's done. So without further ado, let's stick with David Draymond. Let's stick with that name brand and introduce a new name brand with Device. And that's coming up next here on Coverkillernation Reviews.